They pushed humanity beyond its limits. Nazi scientists, Soviet labs, creating monsters, not for science, but for war. The terrifying truth of the superhuman protocol. Architects of the unnatural. In the final chaotic days of April 1945, as the Red Army closed its iron grip around the burning ruins of Berlin, a specialized unit of American intelligence, Operation Paperclip, raced toward a remote research facility in the Harz Mountains. They weren't looking for gold, or even V-2 rockets. They were looking for the new man. Deep inside a subterranean bunker, they found files that defied biological logic, sketches of soldiers who didn't feel pain, records of men who could march for 3 days without a single hour of sleep, formulae for chemical cocktails designed to turn a farm boy into a biological war machine. But as the Americans moved in from the west, the Soviet Union was sweeping in from the east. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, were emptying out the laboratories of Leningrad and Siberia. They were obsessed with the same terrifying vision, the Soviet super soldier, a being with the strength of a beast, the endurance of a machine, and the absolute obedience of a ghost. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the most disturbing chapter of the 20th century. This is not just history. This is the story of how the two greatest powers on Earth attempted to rewrite the human genetic code. These are 8 secret experiments conducted in the shadows of the Iron Curtain and the swastika, designed to create the superhuman. 1. The D9 cocktail, the Phantom Infantry. In 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing, but in the laboratories of Sachsenhausen, a chemist named Gerhard Orzechowski believed he had found the victory pill. It was a chemical compound known as D9. This wasn't just a simple stimulant. D9 was a lethal mixture of 5 milligrams of cocaine, 3 milligrams of risperidone, which we now know as methamphetamine, and 5 milligrams of Eucadol, a potent opioid. The goal was simple: to create a soldier who could carry a full combat load, march 80 kilometers, and fight for 24 hours straight without fatigue, hunger, or fear. They tested D9 on prisoners at Sachsenhausen. They forced them to march in a circle, day and night, carrying 40-pound packs. The results were terrifying. The prisoners didn't stop until they literally collapsed into a coma, or their hearts exploded. The high command was so impressed that they ordered the mass production of D9 for the front lines. They envisioned a phantom infantry that could strike from the dark and never tire, but the war ended before the pill could be fully deployed. When the Allies found the D9 samples, they were stunned. They realized that the Nazis hadn't just created a drug, they had created a way to turn the human nervous system into a battery that could be drained until nothing was left but a shell. 2. Ivanov's Ape Man, the Beast of Labor. While the Nazis were focused on chemicals, the Soviets were looking at something much more visceral. In the 1920s, Joseph Stalin reportedly gave a chilling order to the renowned biologist Ilya Ivanov. He said, "I want a new, invincible human being, insensitive to pain, resistant to poor food, and possessing the strength of a gorilla." Stalin wasn't speaking metaphorically. Ivanov was a pioneer in artificial insemination. His mission, funded by the Soviet state, was to create a human-ape hybrid. The Soviets envisioned a race of living machines, creatures with the intelligence of a man, but the raw, muscular power of a chimpanzee. They could work the mines of Siberia without complaining, and they could serve as a frontline shock force that would terrify any conventional army. Ivanov traveled to French Guinea in West Africa with thousands of dollars in Soviet gold. He attempted to crossbreed humans and chimpanzees in a series of disturbing experiments that were eventually shut down by colonial authorities. But Ivanov didn't stop. He returned to a secret laboratory in Abkhazia, where he sought volunteers for the final stage of his project. The experiment eventually failed, and Ivanov was purged and exiled during Stalin's paranoid years. But the files remained. They proved that for the Soviet leadership, the human form was not sacred. It was merely raw material to be engineered. 3. The Ahnenerbe and the Aryan Anatomy. The Ahnenerbe was not just a research group, it was Heinrich Himmler's personal, occult-driven think tank. While the public saw them as eccentric historians hunting for the Holy Grail or the Spear of Destiny, their real work was far more clinical and far more lethal. They were obsessed with a concept they called Nordic resilience. They believed that the Aryan race possessed dormant, prehistoric genetic abilities, superhuman traits that had been buried by centuries of soft living. To unlock these traits, they believed the body had to be pushed to the absolute brink of death through extreme biological stress. In the freezing, desolate barracks of Dachau, they conducted the infamous hypothermia experiments. Led by the ruthless doctor Sigmund Rascher, prisoners were submerged in vats of ice water for hours at a time. Rascher wasn't just looking for a way to save downed pilots in the North Sea. He was looking for the resuscitation spark. He wanted to know if a human could be brought back from the dead, and if their body would emerge stronger, hardened by the cold. They documented the exact moment the heart slowed, the point where the blood began to crystallize, and the horrifying screams of those being re-warmed by boiling water or animal heat. But they went even further into the realm of nightmare. They attempted to find the limit of human pressure. Prisoners were locked inside high-altitude decompression chambers that simulated a fall from 60,000 feet. Rascher watched through a thick glass porthole as the air was slowly sucked out. He documented the biological horror in real time, the subjects' lungs collapsing, their eardrums shattering, and eventually, their brains swelling so violently against their skulls that the bone would crack. They weren't just looking for survival data, they were looking for the X factor, a biological adaptation that would allow a Nazi or a soldier to operate in the vacuum of high altitude or the crushing depths of the ocean where any other human would simply perish. When the war ended, the Manual of Human Limits, a blood-stained collection of data on how much a human can suffer before the soul leaves the body, didn't disappear. It was seized by Operation Paperclip and would later, chillingly, provide the foundational data for NASA and the U.S. Air Force's early space programs. 4. Brukhonenko's autojector, the undead soldier. In 1940, as the world burned, the Soviet Union released a propaganda film that felt like a glimpse into a dark future. It was titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. It featured a machine that shouldn't have existed, the autojector. The lead scientist, Sergei Brukhonenko, demonstrated a feat that looked like pure black magic. He had decapitated a dog and connected its severed head to his machine. The autojector acted as an external heart instead of lungs, pumping oxygenated, chemically treated blood through the arteries of the head. On film, the dog's head responded to sound. Its eyes followed a light across the room, and it even licked its nose when stimulated with citric acid. For all intents and purposes, the head was alive. But Brukhonenko's ultimate goal was never about saving animals. The Kremlin saw the autojector as the blueprint for the undead soldier. They envisioned a battlefield where a soldier's biological vulnerabilities, the heart, the lungs, the liver, could be replaced by a rugged mechanical unit carried in a backpack. A soldier who could survive a bullet to the chest because his heart was a pump. A soldier who could continue to fight even after losing half his body. This was the true birth of the cyborg concept. The Soviets viewed death not as an inevitable end, but as a mechanical failure that could be bypassed with the right plumbing. If they could master the autojector, they could create an army that literally could not be stopped, because their life force was no longer tied to the fragility of a human pulse, but to the cold, rhythmic ticking of a machine. 5. Project Nord, the steroid genesis. Long before the modern scandals of the Olympics or the TDF, the Nazis were the first to play God with human hormones. In the mid-1930s, German scientists, funded directly by the state, became the first in history to successfully synthesize the male hormone, testosterone. They called it Project Nord. But the high command wasn't interested in building bigger muscles for the beach. They were looking to solve a psychological problem: aggression fatigue. They believed that the moral compass and the empathy response were weaknesses of the modern mind. By injecting soldiers with astronomical doses of synthetic testosterone, they hoped to bypass the conscience. They wanted a warrior who was hyper-aggressive, hyper-focused, and completely physically dominant. They tested these early experimental steroids on elite SS units, observing how their recovery times from bone-shattering injuries were cut in half. The soldiers became walking towers of muscle, capable of feats of strength that seemed impossible. But there was a side effect the scientists hadn't prepared for: the roid rage. The SS guards became so volatile, so uncontrollably violent, that they began turning on their own officers, and eventually on themselves. Project Nord was the secret dark foundation of all modern athletic enhancement. When Berlin fell, the formulae were split between the Americans and the Soviets, sparking a hormonal arms race that would dominate the world for the next 50 years, and forever change the definition of what human strength actually means. 6. The Soviet sleep experiment, the no-sleep protocol. In the late 1940s, in a hidden facility deep within the Ural Mountains, Soviet researchers conducted an experiment that has since entered the annals of urban legend. They wanted to solve the military's oldest enemy: sleep. The theory was simple. If a soldier didn't need to sleep, a nation could double its industrial productivity and triple its military power overnight. They took 5 political prisoners, men the state considered disposable, and placed them in a sealed glass chamber. They pumped in a specialized stimulant gas, a precursor to modern amphetamines, designed to keep them awake for 30 days straight. By day 5, the subjects began to show signs of extreme paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began whispering to the microphones. By day 9, the screaming started. 2 of the prisoners ran around the room, screaming so loudly and so long that their vocal cords literally tore from the strain. But then, by day 15, the screaming stopped. A terrifying silence fell over the chamber. When the researchers, fearing for their data, finally opened the seals, they found that the subjects had undergone a physical and psychological transformation that defied medical science. They had become feral, their strength had quadrupled, and they seemed to no longer feel pain. They fought with a primal, unhuman energy. While the mainstream world dismisses this as creepypasta, declassified files on sleep deprivation studies from both the KGB and the CIA show that both superpowers were obsessed with finding the wakefulness chemical, the key to a soldier who never closes his eyes and never stops hunting. 7. The Red Machine and the Adaptogen's Secret. While the West was experimenting with harsh, crashing chemicals like benzodrine, the Soviets discovered a secret weapon hidden in the frozen mountains of Siberia. It wasn't a lab-grown chemical. It was an ancient, resilient plant called Eleutherococcus. They called it an adaptogen. For decades, the Soviet Olympic teams and the elite Spetsnaz units were fed a secret, highly concentrated protocol of these adaptogens. These weren't simple vitamins. These were biological compounds that allowed the body to adapt to extreme physical and mental stress without the devastating crash or withdrawal of traditional drugs. They wanted a natural super soldier, a man who could endure the freezing Siberian winter, the thin air of the Himalayas, and the crushing, lightless pressure of deep-sea diving without his heart giving out. This was the Red Machine protocol. It was a silent revolution. The results were undeniable. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet athletes and special forces became an unstoppable force, breaking world records with a frequency that looked like magic. The world thought it was just hard work and communism, but behind the Iron Veil, it was a sophisticated program of biological modification. They weren't just training their men. They were using the Earth's most resilient plants to push the human body past its natural evolutionary limits, creating a human being that was biologically superior to anything the West had to offer. 8. The K-44 Project. The genetic reprogramming. In the final desperate years of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union began to crack, rumors emerged of a project known only by its codename, K-44. This was the absolute pinnacle of their superhuman research. They weren't looking at external drugs or mechanical hearts anymore. They were looking at the very code of life, gene splicing. Using early recombinant DNA technology, the Soviets attempted to edit the embryos of children born to their most elite athletes and most decorated soldiers. They were searching for the strength gene, the endurance gene, and the intelligence gene. They wanted to breed a generation of humans who were born super, a race of people for whom a marathon was a stroll, and a complex physics equation was child's play. They wanted to create a master class of citizens who were biologically destined to lead. While the project was officially canceled when the Berlin Wall fell, many whistleblowers and former KGB agents claim that the K-44 generation is still out there. They are now adults, living among us, in positions of power, science, and influence. They are the first true post-humans created in a laboratory, the silent living legacy of a regime that refused to accept the limits of human nature. The final analysis: the amnesia of a species and the echoes of a lost past. When we look at these 8 extraordinary artifacts, the pattern becomes undeniable, chillingly clear. We are being lied to, not necessarily out of malice, but perhaps out of a desperate need for order, a fear of disrupting the comfortable narrative we have constructed. If we admit that the Antikythera mechanism is real, we have to admit that we lost 1,400 years of technological progress. If we admit that the Piri-Reis map is real, we have to admit that a global civilization with advanced cartographic knowledge existed during the last ice age. Our history, as presented, is a series of convenient rediscoveries. We are like a person who wakes up in a magnificent mansion with no memory, and assumes they built the house simply because they are the ones living in it. But these out-of-place artifacts are the undeniable clues, the breadcrumbs left behind by the original owners, whispering tales of a forgotten legacy. The Earth is not just a planet, it is a vast, silent graveyard of giants and geniuses, of lost empires and forgotten technologies. And until we are brave enough to open the crates in the basements of our museums, until we dare to challenge the dogmas of academia, we will continue to walk in the shadows of a past we are too afraid to remember, forever bound by the amnesia of our species. The truth is out there, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to shatter our illusions. The question is, are we ready to face it? Until next time, keep searching for the truth, especially when they tell you it doesn't exist.